to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. We have Casey Michel. He's an author, journalist, and director of the Combating Kleptocracy Program with the Human Rights Foundation. He's the author of American Kleptocracy, named by The Economist as one of the best books to read to understand financial crime. His writing on offshoring, foreign lobbying, authoritarianism, and illicit wealth has appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and the Washington Post, among other outlets. And he's appeared on NPR, BBC, CNN, and MSNBC, among other stations. He's also testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee on the links between illicit financial networks and national security. And his newest book, available now, is called Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. Casey, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for being here.
Guys, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And such a timely podcast in the context of the election that just happened.
Absolutely.
So in his book, Casey wrote, while the rise of foreign lobbying and foreign agents is a relatively new modern phenomenon, they both have their roots in the earliest days of the United States and with the men who look to take advantage of the new rights a country promised to offer. In late 1792, near the end of George Washington's first term as the first president of the United States, a man named William Hull traveled from Virginia to the budding nation's capital in Philadelphia. He had a plan: test the limits of the nascent U.S. Constitution implemented just 3 years prior and see how far the rights laid out in the First Amendment truly stretched. Specifically, Hull wanted to test the proposition that Americans had a right, a quote-unquote freedom, as the Constitution described it, to lobby or to petition any and all government officials, to pressure them as a mere citizen into passing the kinds of policies they wanted. A vain man, a proud-looking sort with luxuriant hair, as one writer described him, Hull arrived in Philadelphia with an impressive pedigree. A former Revolutionary War officer, he reportedly talked to President Washington as often as he liked. And it was that relationship that Hull counted on. Because he hadn't traveled to Philadelphia just for himself, instead he came at the behest of a group of Virginia military veterans who'd fought under Washington during the recent war for American independence. Years after thrashing the British, they were still waiting on compensation for their services. But the finances of the early American Republic were in shambles, held together with little more than dreams and promises, with American veterans often going without pay while the country found its fiscal footing. Hull wrote to other veterans groups calling for agents to help him push for wartime compensation bill to help those former soldiers. After arriving in Philadelphia, he buttonholed federal legislators, arguing his case, familiarizing himself with the workings of this new national government, and he highlighted the fact that without those veterans, these legislatures wouldn't even have their jobs and might have well have been strung up by British authorities looking to decapitate this rebellious American nation. So, when we think of lobbyists, we often think of greed, and we often think of some sort of behind the scenes sort of dark money, kind of nefarious thing going on. Yeah. So, Casey, let's actually get into, broadly speaking, what lobbying is and also how it differs from diplomacy. Because I think when I first looked over your book, I was thinking, well, how is this different from, let's say, an ambassador? So yeah, let's get into that.
So look, that's a great question. And kind of one of the reasons that I ended up writing this book in the first place. I mean, the book focuses on a specific subset of modern lobbyists. These are the foreign lobbyists, which I'm sure we'll talk about as the conversation goes on. These are the Americans that work for foreign governments, foreign regimes. But look, I mean, I think you're exactly right that the kind of the modern interpretation of lobbying and lobbyists is that it's kind of a sleazy industry unto itself, right? It's worth billions of dollars. It's usually associated with like the deepest pocketed companies and corporations, sometimes individuals that can outspend all of their opponents and buy all of the most talented, most successful lobbyists to do what they want in Washington, D.C. and around the country. And circumvent the democratic process and really manipulate it to their own ends. That's kind of the impression of lobbying in the 21st century. To a large extent, it is true. That does reflect what we see in terms of the deepest pocketed people and companies getting access to the best lobbyists. But what I think a lot of folks don't know or have forgotten, and I'm glad you chose that passage, because that's one that I like going back to remind folks, especially other Americans, that lobbying in the United States of America is not something that just started in the 21st century. It's not just something that started just in the past few decades. It literally goes all the way back to the founding of the United States itself. We're talking about Revolutionary War veterans hiring a lobbyist to go to federal legislators in the George Washington administration to lobby for what was due them. I mean, again, that sounds very similar to what we've seen for veterans of many American wars ever since. But this was right there in the founding of the United States of America. And what I use that passage to try to remind folks, not only that this goes back to the very earliest days of the United States, but also if you take a look at the Constitution, right there in the First Amendment, right next to things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, there's another freedom that a lot of folks don't think about. And in the Constitution, it says that is the right of every American to petition their government for a redress of grievances, which is just an old-timey, old-fashioned way of saying anyone can go to their legislator, their member of the House of Representatives, their senator, their president, their mayor, whatever level of government, and they can advocate for whatever they want. They can push for, environmental policy or healthcare policy or foreign policy, whatever it might be. They have that right as an American to do that. And it wasn't called this at the time, but that's lobbying 101 right there. Every American has the right to do it. It's right there in the Constitution. It is constitutionally protected, which is, I think, a side of lobbying that a lot of folks don't realize, which is what I wanted to get to again in a passage like that in a book like this.
Yeah, and so the difference between, let's say, foreign lobbyists and an ambassador, what would that be? Because we would think, like, wouldn't these people just then actually work as a part of the government?
So it's a great question. There is a lot of overlap, a lot of interplay between traditional diplomacy and lobbying. We see a lot of former members of Congress. We see a lot of former officials in things like the State Department leave office and actually become foreign lobbyists themselves. But I think a lot of folks have a better grasp on what diplomacy actually is, right? These are ambassadors, these are embassies, these are elected officials in the United States or in any other country that are communicating with one another about policy. And look, in a perfect world, maybe that's all that would exist, especially in terms of foreign policy, trade policy, economic policy, all of that. But what we have seen over the past, really, especially 20, 30 years or so, really in the kind of post-Cold War period, is this other element grow up, and that's the foreign lobbyists themselves. And again, these are Americans that work on behalf of foreign countries, on behalf of foreign companies, foreign oligarchs, whatever it might be, and use those constitutionally protected rights to lobby American officials. So these are Americans acting as lobbyists, but not on behalf of other Americans. Now they're operating on behalf of foreign governments and foreign countries themselves. And what they do is they, again, really kind of circumvent the diplomatic process. There's not a lot of oversight about what they are doing. They're certainly not democratically accountable. They're not elected officials or part of any administration that can be voted out of office. Instead, they are making millions of dollars, which is, again, I should also say a lot more money than any diplomats are actually making. Right. They're making millions of dollars to circumvent that diplomatic process. Sometimes they're augmenting it, strengthening it, but all too often they're working around it and subverting it, manipulating it, and doing it directly on behalf of that foreign country. Because again, if we think about it, diplomats, American diplomats, are working for the benefit, at least as they see it, of the United States of America and American interests. But these foreign lobbyists, who are again Americans, they're working on behalf of other countries' interests themselves. So you do see this dividing line between the two, even though they are generally operating simultaneously and by and large in Washington, D.C. itself, although certainly we've seen it spread out around the United States of America in recent years as well.
Yeah. So what I found interesting, so in the book, you discussed the influence of important figures like, let's say, Ivy Lee and Paul Manafort, right? And as foreign agents and their sort of influence on democracy. Could we talk a little bit about Ivy Lee's influence and what exactly he did?
Sure. Had you guys heard of Ivy Lee before the book?
No.
A lot of folks hadn't. He's well known in the public relations sector. He's still remembered, as I'm sure you guys saw in the book, as the father of the PR industry. And every once in a while, I'll talk to someone who's heard of him in that role. But a lot of folks don't know about him or the fact that he basically invented the PR industry itself. So Ivy Lee was a guy that worked in the late 19th, early 20th century. He's an American. And again, basically invented the PR industry. It didn't exist before he came along. You had specific publicists and spokespeople, but he was really the guy that created the PR industry.
Just curious, was this at the time of Edward Bernays too?
He was basically a counterpart of Bernays itself. Oh. If anything, Bernays is probably better remembered than this guy, Ivy Lee himself, and for whatever reasons that may be. But they were basically counterparts. Lee was the guy that invented the first press release. He basically invented the crisis management playbook for how again, companies and political figures and tycoons of the era, the Rockefellers and Woodrow Wilson and Charles Schwab, those types, how they could use public opinion to their advantage and how they could work past crises that did emerge. And he was incredibly successful. I mean, he became basically a celebrity unto himself in the 1910s and in the 1920s. And then World War I happened, and he realized that there are all these brand new countries that were emerging from the rubble of the war itself. And he realized that he could take his services, he could take that kind of PR playbook that he developed for himself and take all of his contacts in Washington, D.C. as well. And he could take that to those countries that were emerging in Europe and in Asia. And he made all these trips back and forth from Europe to the United States. And he started signing up as clients all of these brand new governments, all of these brand new regimes that were looking for advice on talking points, on improving their image, on accessing Americans and American policymakers in Washington, D.C. And you could see while he was doing this, the kind of building blocks for what the foreign lobbying industry eventually became. I said a moment ago, he's considered the father of the PR industry. As far as I'm concerned, he's also the father of the foreign lobbying industry. Which isn't like an inherently bad thing, but the problem ended up being that he wasn't traveling to the Canadas or the Britons or the Irelands of the world and working with them.
Yeah.
He was going to Italy in the 1920s and the 1930s and meeting directly with Mussolini to help that regime. He was traveling to Moscow in the 1920s and the 1930s to meet with all of the Soviet officials that were trying to open doors in the United States of America. And then most notoriously, he traveled to Berlin. He traveled to Germany right as the Nazis began gaining power and had meetings with Adolf Hitler about how to target, how to sway, and how to convince Americans that the Nazis should be our partners, right? We shouldn't be concerned about what's taking place in Germany or Italy or the Soviet Union. We should actually be doing business with them. They should be our partners on the ground. And again, these are the kind of building blocks of the foreign lobbying industry, which if we just fast forward to the 21st century, we still have Americans who are doing this with the Russias and the Chinas and the Irans and the Venezuelas of the world, to say nothing of the other authoritarian regimes around the world. Look, Ivy Lee made a lot of money. He made the modern equivalent of millions of dollars whitewashing all of the worst regimes, all the totalitarian regimes out there. And the only reason he ended up getting found out is because Congress started looking into who exactly was paying him. And they discovered it wasn't who he said, but they discovered it was actually the Nazis themselves that were hiring him for his talents.
Wow.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, literally, he painted Mussolini and like that regime as actually like it's good. I believe in if I remember from the book, like initially the impression of Mussolini in America, due to Ivy Lee was actually kind of positive. Actually,
yeah. This is,
and then Soviets as well. Yeah,
this has been one of the. Look, I'm a very proud American, born and raised here. I've American educational system, all that stuff. And of course, I remember the story of World War II and how what a phenomenal, like ethically, morally decision that was for the United States to take down these regimes. What I have learned about in putting this book together and some of the other things I've worked on is that in the lead up to the Second World War, and again, I'm sure you guys have read some of this stuff as well, it turns out there was a lot more support in the United States for the Mussolinis and for the Hitlers of the world than certainly I was ever taught back in grade school.
Yeah, I mean, Madison Square Garden had that rally, right?
My God, yes, exactly. Mussolini had supporters around the country that said, look, we need an American fascist. We need someone to organize this country. We need someone to get it back up off its knees. And look, I get the appeal. It was the Great Depression, so on and so on and so on. But it turns out it was a lot more widespread than I ever thought, I guess, possible. And in large part because of figures like Ivy Lee, who came back to the United States and said, look, Mussolini's doing great things. The Italian economy is roaring. The Italian society is back up on its feet and all unified behind this guy. And why can't we have something like that in the United States of America? And then, of course, he also said the same things about the Nazis under Hitler. And he was, again, incredibly successful. And fortunately or otherwise, he didn't live long enough to see the Second World War. I don't know what he would have thought of that, but he certainly played a big role in building up the reputations of Mussolini and Hitler in the United States.
Yeah. And so anybody, I guess, having a sort of cursory view of your work or getting into it the first time, they might think, okay, so this makes a lot of sense. And we're going to get into this part, but this makes a lot of sense when it comes to dictators. Of course, they're going to want to hide some of this stuff. Like this is what we know as lobbying, right?
Yeah.
So, but the question is going to rise, but why would Americans have lobbyists, right? Wouldn't we then, for us, right? Wouldn't we then turn to ambassadors or diplomats? Why would we need such a thing?
It's funny. We don't need any of this necessarily. There's no like core national security or foreign policy decision that's riding on these guys acting as foreign lobbyists. The thing that I mentioned earlier, that this is a constitutionally protected right. I mean, this is all completely legal.
Right.
Ivy Lee himself did not commit any crimes. In the 21st century, as long as these lobbyists disclose what they are doing, register their work with the Department of Justice, which then shares that information with the American public, as long as they do that and have some kind of regular filings with, how much they're being paid and what they're doing, none of this is illegal. They're not committing any crimes whatsoever, which is part of the reason that this is now a multi-billion-dollar industry, why it's grown so much, and its impact has also grown so much, is again because these guys aren't committing any crimes whatsoever. But that doesn't, again, necessarily make it something that is needed by Americans or by American legislators. Now, foreign governments, the ones who are paying millions of dollars to these American foreign lobbyists, they do think it is relevant. They think it is necessary. And certainly they think they've seen plenty of success in recent years. And this is kind of pushing fast forward on some of the story of the industry itself. But, I'm sure you guys saw just a couple months ago, and maybe listeners and viewers saw this a couple months ago, there was a conviction of a sitting member of Congress, a senator, the very first time in American history. Maybe you guys remember the afterword for the book, this guy, Bob Menendez, out of New Jersey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Long.
We also see his ads here all the time. So.
Oh, dude. Yeah. Good. Well, he's since resigned, but I suspect, I mean, who knows? He's still got a potential future ahead of him. But look, this guy was in the Senate for years and years. He's a member of the Democratic Party. He was the most powerful senator in terms of American foreign policy. He was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he was convicted a couple months ago of acting as a foreign lobbyist on not Russia or China or Iran or one of these big names, but the government in Egypt, the military dictatorship over there. They had turned him into their foreign lobbyist. He never disclosed any of that work. Now, technically, it's also illegal for members of Congress to do this, but if we're talking about why these regimes hire these guys and why they continue doing so and the kind of success they've seen, they managed to turn the most powerful senator in terms of American foreign policy into their foreign lobbyist. And again, circumvent diplomacy and get plenty of bang for their buck. I suspect there are more stories like that out there in Congress these days that we have to wait to be seen. But yeah, that's the success they've seen.
What has he sold his soul for then? What did they give him?
This is one of those things where it's truth is stranger than fiction. So he's secretly messaging them, how he's going to vote about certain things, and sensitive information about who's working at the American embassy in Cairo, and all this stuff that they're getting on these back channels. What he is getting, in addition to secretive payments themselves, maybe you guys remember, he got a number of gold bars from the Egyptians. And look, I get it, gold bars.
They're just sending him gold bars.
His excuse was that his family was Cuban exiles and that you never know when a revolution is going to happen, and you got to have gold bars on hand just in case. Now, the thing that ended up tripping him up, this may never have come out. He may never have been found out, but or at least the gold bars, but he ended up Googling how much is a gold bar worth, which the prosecutors used in their conviction. Again, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah. It's like a Warner Brothers comedy.
It really is. And I don't know what happened to those gold bars. I'm not sure where they are these days, but I don't think he got to keep them.
Yeah. Wow.
And you've made some mention of this, but like, what is the oversight on these foreign agents? I mean, I know there's, for example, like FARA, right? You do have to register with them, and that's part of it. But what other sorts of oversight are there for these foreign agents?
Sure. So that's a great question. The I'll take the second part first. The second part, what other elements are there in terms of oversight? There's not a lot. Right now, the only thing is what you just mentioned, FARA, which is an acronym, FARA, stands for Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is where I got the title of the book from, Foreign Agents. This goes back to the days of Ivy Lee, when legislators realized what he was doing and how there was no regulation around it whatsoever. They realized they can't make it illegal because, again, it's constitutionally protected, but they can require certain disclosures. So we talked about this, I think, a minute ago, where now foreign lobbyists have to disclose what they're doing and who they're doing it for and how much money they're making along the way. And every once in a while, how many gold bars they're passing along to legislators themselves. Look, it's about transparency is what it is. Again, it's not making any of this illegal. It's just about bringing transparency so that you or I or anyone else with a computer can go to the Department of Justice website, and they have a whole database right there. They have a whole Foreign Agents Registration Act database. You can just Google it, right? FARA, Foreign Agents Registration Act database, and anyone can look through what any country, France or Mexico or Australia or whatever, is doing in terms of foreign lobbying, who they are hiring, how much they are paying them, and then what those lobbyists are actually doing, who they're meeting with in Congress, or what journalists are talking to, or what articles are trying to write for what outlets. I mean, the list goes on. What events they're organizing. The list goes on and on. And again, the theory of this, why these legislators passed this in the first place, is that if you bring some transparency to this, if you bring some sunlight to this, then Americans can realize what other Americans are doing on behalf of these foreign countries. And if they don't like what they're doing, again, it's not a crime, but you can publicly shame them into dropping those clients, no longer working for the Hitlers and the Mussolinis of the world. I mean, it's a very nice theory, but
it's tough to do. Yeah.
You guys exist in 21st century America. I exist in 21st century America. There's not a lot that shame can do these days, right? Which is why basically every country this side of North Korea is able to hire American lobbyists who are willing to sell their souls to the worst people in the world. And again, make a lot of money doing it. But to answer the question about transparency, if folks want a better look at this, just go on your computer and Google FARA database, Foreign Agents Registration Act database. This is the primary oversight mechanism. It's the only reason I was able to write the book in the first place, is because it has a massive amount of data that a lot of folks still don't look through, that can tell you so much and can share so many stories about what these foreign agents are doing and how they're actually succeeding at the end of the day.
Yeah. All right, so then let's get into some modern examples of this. So who is Paul Manafort and what is his lobbying history?
Paul Manafort, another key figure in the book itself. If folks remember him, he was Donald Trump's 2016 campaign manager in Trump's first term. He wasn't involved in the most recent campaign, but he did pop up from time to time. I suspect he's still having conversations with them. That's kind of his claim to fame. But what a lot of folks didn't know before that was that he also spent decades working first as a lobbyist in the United States for American clients, but then most especially for foreign clients as well. So if we go back to the story of Ivy Lee, that guy began working with politicians and corporate executives and so on in the United States before taking his talents to the Mussolinis and the Hitlers of the world. It's basically the same story with Paul Manafort. He was working in the 1970s and the 1980s with Gerald Ford. He was working with Ronald Reagan, acting as a political consultant for them. And then he started working as a kind of a real lobbyist for big American companies, right? Big steel companies, oil companies, so on and so forth, and was very successful, right? He was able to bring those companies into Washington and open doors for them, and then bring those members of Congress to those companies when they needed donations for re-election. I mean, he was very, very successful in doing this. He never had to become a foreign lobbyist, but he got those dollar signs in his eyes, and he realized by the 1990s through the 2000s, my God, he can make millions of dollars working with all of these regimes. And again, you think about the 1990s, if you go back to the 1990s, right, it is kind of similar to after World War I, right? It's a new geopolitical era. The Cold War has ended. All these new governments are emerging and looking for help in Washington, D.C. And here's Paul Manafort, really the right person at the right time, or maybe the worst person at the worst time, depending on your perspective, and said, look, I can help you with whatever you want, with whatever you need. I can connect you with whoever you need. I can provide whatever services you need. And you had regime after regime. And again, these aren't New Zealand or Norway or whatever other democratic countries. These are I mean, these are dictators, right? These are places like Somalia, places like Angola, places like Nigeria, places like the Philippines under Marcos that were hiring him for all of these different reasons, all of these different needs. But basically, at the end of the day, they wanted a man in Washington, and he was their man. Anyways, he ended up, which folks may remember, also working with the regime, the elected but increasingly authoritarian regime in Ukraine in the early 2010s with a guy, Viktor Yanukovych, who was very much undercutting, very much dismantling Ukraine's democracy. He ended up getting thrown out of power in 2014 during Ukraine's democratic revolution. And of course, the rest is very much ongoing history. But Manafort was his guy in Washington and in Kyiv, helping cement that regime until, if I can swear, until it all went to shit for them.
Mhm.
And Manafort had to basically flee back to the United States of America, and probably wouldn't have done much after that, except Donald Trump decided to run for president in 2016 and needed a guy who knew what he was doing, and in stepped Paul Manafort. So that's Manafort's career in a nutshell. He very much invented the modern foreign lobbying industry, made a lot of money doing it. And as far as anyone can tell, he's still out there doing something, although what that is not quite clear right now.
And I guess and this can have various answers. I'm sort of working on how to even articulate this, but I'll try. So, to what extent could, let's say, a foreign agent who is being paid by whichever regime or country, to what extent, if they act as a political consultant, what are the sorts of things that they're able to do as a political consultant? Like, in the sense that, is it that now they were given money? Are they paying somebody else? Are they running political campaigns? Are they just telling their buddies, their political buddies, this place is great, or I don't know, here, invest in this area or something? I don't know.
It's all of that. It's all of that and more, right? So they're in their with their lobbying hat on, right? They're organizing meetings in Washington with members of Congress, with members of the Senate, sometimes even members of the White House itself, to advocate for what their clients want in terms of policies, in terms of sanctions being lifted, in terms of tariffs being lifted, in terms of whatever their foreign clients want. At the end of the day, I think the one statistic that stood out to me was there's another researcher that I cited who done some analysis on this. Every country that hired lobbyists to lobby for economic aid from the United States, and again, this is taxpayer dollars. Every country that lobbied for it got it. And almost every country that lobbied for military aid from the United States of America got it as well. It doesn't matter if it's a democratic regime, dictatorial regime, didn't matter. Almost all of them ended up getting it because of these lobbyists themselves. Now, that's the kind of traditional lobbying guys. That's like at a bare minimum, that's what they're going to be doing. But they're also going to be writing articles for public consumption about why the regime is great and why their critics, many of whom have fled to the United States, should not be trusted, should not be listened to, are not worth their salt. Get them out of here. They're helping silence criticism from those who are often in the United States itself. I think the thing that stood out most to me in putting this together, that was, I guess, maybe the most, not a lot shocks me necessarily, but maybe that was the most shocking of all of this, is that foreign lobbyists, even here we are in 2024, there's no restrictions on what they can do in terms of donating to electoral campaigns, members of Congress or members of the White House, or even local races. Like there's no restrictions on that whatsoever. They are just as any other firm, any other American can donate up to whatever the limit actually is. Which, if you look at it legally, okay, that's fine. Why are we trying to discriminate against this one kind of class of Americans? The problem is these guys are all reliant on funding from their foreign clients themselves, from the Chinas and the Russias and the Iran. So what we end up seeing happening, and again, none of this is illegal. What ends up happening is all these regimes plow all of this money that on paper looks like they're just paying for lobbying services, or they're paying for whatever, setting up the meetings in Washington. But what we see, and we know this because of the federal filings that track this, is that they get millions of dollars in from these foreign clients. And sometimes even on the same day, these firms are then donating millions of dollars to the members of Congress that they're actually lobbying. There's no contract that's saying, look, we're giving you money on behalf of the regime in Moscow or, Belarus or Kazakhstan or whatever it is. but the numbers kind of speak for themselves, because this all tends to happen in one direction, where they're acting as basically the middleman for these foreign regimes trying to get that money to these members of Congress themselves. Members of Congress cannot accept donations from foreign nationals. That is a huge red line. You guys saw
that's that's the limit.
That's the limit. Yeah, well, it used to be the limit until Eric Adams, our dear beloved mayor, decided one day to go call up his friends over in Turkey and say, "Look, I need some money. Can you guys help me out?" But that's a different. I mean, that's the same story, but that's a different story.
You know, it's funny. We had him on the show actually before he was the mayor. Before he was the mayor, when he was Brooklyn Borough President.
Yeah. Well, when he was running, so we had him on literally the week of or the week before he announced.
Yeah.
Oh my God. So the thing about that, you know, what's beautiful about he was working as Brooklyn Borough President, and I remember someone sending me an article about how the Brooklyn Borough President was going on all these trips. To and this one in particular was to Azerbaijan.
Oh my God.
And I remember this must have been 10 years ago. I remember getting that email and be like, huh, that's weird. That's never going to be relevant for anything I ever do, but that's kind of weird. And so I just tucked that away, and then all of a sudden, so good. How was the conversation you guys had with him?
Listen,
at the time, it was great.
He was a very good dude to us, man. That's why a lot of this, I mean, like, listen, at this point, so I mean, I'll only speak for myself. I am no longer supporting him no matter what. But in terms of like how he was with us, especially behind the scenes stuff, man, he was a very good guy, man. And at the time in 2020, we had very little to offer from our podcast. Like we probably were less than a year in at the time. And so he was really good to us, man. So
look, look, I tell you this, he's got a lot of allies. Even with everything that's happened, he's still got a lot of friends.
Yeah.
And I mean, look, there's going to be a new administration coming in Washington. There's going to be a new Department of Justice. It's possible. I mean, we know some investigations are going to be dropped. It's possible other investigations are going to be dropped. And if he doesn't go to trial before that, you know, he's going to be sitting pretty for re-election. He's not going to be under investigation anymore. So who knows?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
He's still in it. But yeah, he said, there's no red lines for him, apparently, according to the indictment. But for a lot of other members of Congress, at least, there are.
Right. So I'm sorry. So we were just because we got off track. So yeah, so going back to the red line, right? So essentially politicians aren't allowed to take direct money and funding from the governments, but they're allowed to take them from lobbyists, right?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
So here's going to be my question. So here's what I don't understand, right? So I'll just use Ukraine as an example, right? So let's say Zelensky usually comes here on his own. I mean, for the most part, I mean, maybe he has some diplomats or whatever coming, but it's usually him, right? So for somebody like Zelensky to come in, I mean, it hits the light of day, right? So all of us know it's on CNN. We know Zelensky's lobbying for money. We get it. We want to give it to him. I'm sorry for every piece of shit that says that we shouldn't fund Ukraine anymore. You're a fucking moron. So I do not care. So Zelensky comes in, he asks for money, right? So we get it. It makes a lot of sense, right? So why, maybe this is a stupid question, but alas, so why isn't it so that we don't allow that we don't allow ambassadors, again, who it's all in the light of day, to come in to say, hey, listen, we're being attacked by dictators. You know, we need help. The United States is like, yeah, sure. Obviously makes a lot of sense. We are a beacon for democracy. Great. Right. So why is that? Why can't it be that remains, like that doesn't remain allowed? And then on the other end, we actually just ban lobbying. We ban foreign lobbying. Why not?
So again, this gets back to, because like for as morally and as ethically and you know, correct as a position like that would be at the end of the day, you've got these legal realities that again are baked into the Constitution, which is not only what makes it so difficult to ban foreign lobbying itself, but even to do anything about domestic lobbying, because at the end of the day, lobbying it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Foreign lobbying is a multi-billion-dollar subset of that, but it's only like 25 or 30% of the total expenditures. Lobbying is still predominantly domestic. And all of it, I mean, that's really that's the answer at the end of the day. Now, what's interesting about the Zelensky example is that what makes it difficult to get me up on my soapbox and say all of these foreign agents, all of these foreign lobbyists are a bunch of assholes. They all deserve to be tossed in jail. They are like morally heinous human beings. You know, they should all be deported. What makes it difficult for me to say that is because then you have cases like Ukraine or other countries around the world that are struggling or suffering under, you know, I guess imperial, I mean, places like Taiwan, places like South Korea, you know, so on. The list goes on and on. They hire their own foreign lobbyists. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, especially in the Ukraine case, that's kind of a different story. I don't have a lot of more moral compunctions about saying the Ukrainians should be allowed to hire these other Americans because they're the ones fighting the good fight, right? Look, you're preaching to the choir. Ukraine should get every cent that it's asking for and then some, and needs to be continue to be supported until the Russians are evicted from every square inch, so on and so on. But that is for a country at war, right? You have Zelensky going back and forth. They can only do so much. Their diplomatic corps is stretched thin. So then they hire these lobbyists on the ground in the United States. Those are the ones that can go to the legislators these days, especially on the Republican side, though who knows if that will always be the case, to say, look, you have to continue your support. Look, your constituents are supporting Ukraine. We're going to your constituents. We're encouraging this. We're advocating for this. Look, it's the right cause at the end of the day, because if you do ban these foreign lobbyists, that is a tool that the Ukrainians are going to have to go without. But I do think still there's an argument to be made that morally, ethically, probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if foreign lobbying was finally banned, but I don't know if we're ever going to see that day.
Do you think we'll see a day where there are just restrictions placed on, amounts? Because I mean, lobbying really does favor the rich, right? I mean, yes, it is a constitutional right, but like to what? Yeah. I mean, I guess if you're creative as somebody without, a lot of money, maybe there's something you do.
Oh, no. Can I just make a really quick? Sure. So poor people protest, rich people lobby.
I love that. Was that you? Was that yours?
No, I just made that up.
We're going to write that down.
Patent that, put it in an article,
clip it. In a book.
Right. Yeah. You're exactly right, because those are the ones that can afford the lobbyists, right? And the lobbyists at the end of the day are the ones that know how to open doors in Congress and get what they want in terms of tax breaks or whatever the policy might be. Whereas, yes, those that can't afford it are just stuck out on the street, and yeah, they're loud, but how much are they actually affecting at the end of the day? Al, I think we're going to see more restrictions. I do, because at the end of the day, that kind of is the only solution that's on the table. We've seen some bills in Congress that would make it illegal for former members of the cabinet, in addition to presidents and vice presidents, make it illegal for them to leave office and lobby at least for 2 years, maybe 5 years, maybe even permanently. We've seen other bills that want to make it illegal to lobby on behalf of countries that are formally deemed American adversaries, places like North Korea, places like Syria, places like Iran, and a couple others. Those haven't passed yet, but I suspect at some point they will, and we'll see those kinds of restrictions themselves. I don't know if we're ever going to see a cap on how much money these guys can make from foreign lobbying. I don't know if we're going to see that, and we haven't. I don't know when this is going to happen, but what I was talking about a minute ago about how it really is unlimited how much these foreign lobbyists can donate to campaigns, even when their only clients are these foreign regimes, these foreign dictators in places like Saudi Arabia or Rwanda or whatever it might be. I think that's got to be the next kind of big domino to fall, and I don't know when that's going to happen. There needs to be some either transparency or limit, if not making that illegal itself. I know there's been some discussion in Washington about that, but that kind of has to be the next domino to fall if we're ever going to really start trying to hem in this industry a little bit.
Wait, so I'm curious. So there's no, I might be misunderstanding, but is there a limit on how much they could contribute to campaigns or no?
Well, the limit is whatever the limit is for you or I or any other American, right? So they can go up to that limit. And then, of course, there's things like super PACs where they, as far as I'm aware, can just donate unlimited amounts too. And of course, the super PACs technically, legally don't coordinate with the candidates themselves, however much that's worth. But so the limits are what any other limit for anyone else is.
Wow, man.
Yeah.
And then you also had a pretty interesting story about Azerbaijan, since we talked about it. I actually wanted to ask you about it. Can you tell us about it?
You guys ever been to Azerbaijan? Have you guys
Absolutely not.
No.
Not yet. That's all right. I mean, I'm sure it's got, Baku, the capital city's
supposed to be lovely. We have a Baku palace here.
There you go. Yeah. No, look, there's a couple good Azeri restaurants here in town, and I unfortunately still have not been, but I've got some Azeri friends, and they're all wonderful. But the regime over there, look, it's been a dictatorship for decades. It's been a dictatorship ever since it declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. First, it was a father. Now it is his son that is overseeing the hereditary dictatorship. And look, it's as brutal as anyone else. It targets, there's no opposition figures. There's no opposition press. I'm sure you guys have been following the news the last few years about the ethnic cleansing and the what was Nagorno-Karabakh. All the ethnic Armenians have had to flee. That's its own story unto itself. We don't need to go down that road. But what Azerbaijan has been really amazing. I mean, it's a relatively small country. Not a lot of folks, I mean, visit it, let alone necessarily follow the policy. But it has been really fascinating to watch how this dictatorship has just poured all of this money into these foreign lobbying efforts. It really punches above its weight in terms of its foreign lobbying, and also in terms of some of the scandals that we have seen emerge in the foreign lobbying space. So in a nutshell, the reason that I wrote this book, the reason I got interested in this is because I was working as a journalist years and years ago out of Houston, Texas, which has its own Azerbaijan community that had a new cultural center. I was doing a story on it. And when I finished doing the story, the woman there, she looked at me, she said, Casey, you seem interested in Azerbaijan. We've got some members of Congress that are flying over in a couple of weeks. It's going to be the biggest congressional trip that's ever gone. What do you say? Would you like to come? And I go, yeah, that sounds great. I'm a broke journalist. I would love to go. She goes, oh, that's wonderful. Even better. We're going to pay for your flight, pay for your hotels. It's going to be great. And I said, oh, that's such wonderful news to me with the empty wallet. And she says, look, we've got one request for you though. And I go, okay. And she says, just, when you're over there, don't write anything negative about the country or about the government, about anything we're doing. And I go, I wish you hadn't asked me that. I can't do that. I can't make that promise. She said, all right, that's too bad. And I said, I went home later that day and I said, boy, that was kind of that was a weird little conversation. That was a weird little request. Kind of filed that in the back of my mind. Never really thought I would do anything with it. But a couple of weeks go by, these members of Congress go over, they're wined and dined. It's this lavish setup over in Azerbaijan. They're getting these gifts, these crystal tea sets. They're getting these $1,000 rugs from the regime, all these different, lavish gifts. And they all come back to the United States and start talking about, oh, Azerbaijan's a wonderful country. There are no human rights concerns. It's a transitioning democracy. It's an American ally. And I'm like, well, those guys kind of suck. I see, how this lobbying is working. But what really ended up happening is a year or two later, all of a sudden they start investigating. Other members of Congress and other journalists start investigating who paid for all this, who was secretly bankrolling this entire trip. It turns out that on paper, it looked like they were these nonprofits in the United States that were dedicated to improving U.S.-Azerbaijan relations. But in reality, they were just getting all of their funding from the Azerbaijan government. So they were basically, again, just like a cutout on the ground, funneling all of these millions of dollars to pay for members of Congress to fly over to Azerbaijan to hear about how wonderful the regime is. That was the biggest scandal of all the 2010s in terms of foreign lobbying. And again, it was Azerbaijan. Maybe this didn't even make it into the book. It was so recent. Maybe you guys saw 6 months ago, there's another member of Congress out of Texas who's now facing his own indictment. He's the first member of the House of Representatives in American history indicted of acting as a foreign agent on behalf of Azerbaijan. He and his wife taking tens of thousands of dollars to push for pro-Azerbaijan policies. Now, the best part of this story, and I know it's kind of a rambly story, but the best part for me is that maybe 2 months ago or so, that woman who asked me all those years ago to go on this trip, in the indictment for this House of Representatives, guys, it turns out that she was basically his handler, helping organize all of this. And she pleaded guilty a couple months ago to acting as a foreign agent. And when I saw her name, I said, Jesus Christ, I know that woman. I know who she is. I know exactly who she is. And so, yeah, it can be a small world at times. But this is what Azerbaijan has been doing. And it has been really kind of setting the bar for plenty of other countries looking to access Americans as well.
Yeah. Yeah, as we're talking about this, and I know this isn't necessarily the territory of your book, but I am curious. You don't have to answer this question if you feel like you don't want to. But I'm kind of wondering, do you feel like, just in terms of not only just foreign lobbying, but just generally speaking, do you ever get the sense, at least in the past, like maybe couple of months, maybe past couple of years, that Americans don't seem to care too much about corruption? Like, we keep voting in these same politicians who keep doing the same thing. And yeah, people seem to get mad or whatever, pump their fists in the air. But ultimately, like, even if it's, let's say, even if one person is removed, essentially we get the same kind of revolving door of the same kind of politicians.
Look, I'd be keen for your guys' thoughts, because you have more conversations in this space, frankly, than I do. But from my very limited perspective, I mean, yes, they care about it at certain times and with certain people and in certain ways. I mean, Bob Menendez, right, the guy that I mentioned a moment ago, the former senator, like he was forced to resign, right? He had to pay a political price, and Eric Adams might still have to pay a political price. I guess we'll see about that. But corruption never becomes the overarching thing that people care about, right? I mean, the most recent election, just a couple of days ago, what did it come down to, right? Inflation and, pocketbook issues, and probably immigration as well. Those were probably the big two issues. Neither of those are necessarily related to corruption, which is why you see a guy like Donald Trump. And look, I've written very critically about Trump's foreign financial entanglements and the kind of opening that presents for foreign lobbying networks. And of course, the Trump organization has plenty of investments in plenty of dictatorships around the world. Mm-hmm. And Paul Manafort, at the end of the day, was Trump's guy back in 2016. But that didn't seem to matter. I don't know if that moved any voters whatsoever. It didn't even necessarily move my vote at the end of the day. So, yeah, I think in times and in places, and every once in a while, you see it go beyond just one person. But by and large, yeah, I think people kind of say, all right, this is business as usual. And so long as it's not my guy or my team doing it, then I don't necessarily care. It's always those guys over there. And the problem with the foreign lobbying world is that it's very bipartisan, right? It's not just Republicans who do it. It's not just Democrats who do it. It's people on both sides of the aisle that are taking full advantage and making a lot of money, which is one of the reasons it's been so difficult to do anything about it.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you guys think? I mean, look,
I mean, for me, it just, to me, like, no matter what corruption you see, like, okay, like, for example, Trump also was like, people were like, oh, Trump is going to go to jail, right? Like, remember that narrative? Okay. Yeah. So having all of that stuff out on him, right? People were aware, but, and, that didn't necessarily go away. It's interesting. Like when people were voting recently, it probably wasn't at the forefront of their mind, right? But what I think it comes down to is just that whole tribalism thing, right? Which is just, you identify with who you feel represents you the most. You're also kind of limited by your choice. You're only given, well, I mean, yes, you can go with the Green Party, you can go with the Libertarian, of course. But at the end of the day, it's really two choices, basically. And people don't think about that. So they're just like, okay, out of these two people, who am I going to go with? I'm still going to vote anyway. And despite this person's misgivings or that person's misgivings. So
yeah, and let me say this before I give you my answer. So this is from the New York Times. So the same dynamic of populism, quote unquote populism winning. So the same dynamic is haunting leaders all over the world. Over the past few years, voters have thrown out incumbents on the left and on the right in Britain, France, the Netherlands, Argentina, Italy, and Australia. The top political parties in South Africa, Japan, and India also face disappointing elections. Canada's and Germany's incumbents are in danger of losing their jobs next year. Higher prices are the central reason. In the aftermath of the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, prices spiked worldwide. So honestly, man, I'm kind of forming now the most cynical view possible. I actually don't even really necessarily think it's tribalism, and here's why. So I would say, because it seems like with voters, I mean, I think for the most part with I don't want to say people like us, because I don't necessarily mean people who care about this stuff, but I mean people like we know, right? So the people we tend to know, they seem to be pretty political, meaning, so like the Republicans we know tend to vote Republicans, like the Democrats that we know, like us or me, we tend to vote Democrat, right? So, but what I think happens a lot around the country is I don't think people care too much about politics. Honestly, man, the sense that I get is that most people, for the most part, are self-serving. So it makes me, so here's what I'm going to say. I'll say this. So we're talking about your book, right? And so when I'm going through the material and I'm looking at it and I'm listening to podcasts and I'm like, fuck, man, this stuff is so important. Like, I really hope that people know about it, right? And in some sort of kind of self-important part internally, it's telling me, yes, it's so great that we're doing this podcast and people need to know this information. We don't get this stuff a lot on the news a lot of the time, yada, yada, right? But however, when you look at the way people vote, I'm also feeling incredibly hopeless. So I don't even think it's necessarily tribal. I actually think it's worse than that. I literally think inflation and immigration is the main issue, or are the main issues. And the reason why I think immigration even matters is because of prices and because of perceived job loss. Again, these are most of the time jobs that these people don't want. But the point is to say that I actually don't even think it's tribal. I don't even think the thinking is like, oh, this doesn't benefit my party. I think it's, this doesn't benefit me.
Yeah. Look, I mean, you said it more eloquently than I did. I agree with every word of that. And I think, what are we, 4 days after the election? if it didn't go your way, I think feeling a little hopeless right now is perfectly fine to feel. Hopefully that hopelessness isn't still there in 2 years or in 4 years, let alone longer from now. I will say the maybe silver lining to having a figure like Trump back in the White House in a few months. I mentioned earlier that this book wouldn't have been written without something like the Foreign Agents Registration Act and all the information that database provides in terms of what these networks and what these lobbyists are actually doing. The book wouldn't have been written if Donald Trump hadn't been elected in 2016 and brought a figure like Paul Manafort with him, because it really wasn't until then that anyone in America, even those who are in the government that are supposed to be monitoring this stuff, really cared. I mean, you could count, and you guys saw this in the book, you count on one hand the prosecutions, the investigations into foreign lobbying for like 50 years before Donald Trump came along. And, fair or otherwise, it wasn't until a rise of a figure like him who, again, brought all of these unprecedented financial entanglements and openings for all these regimes around the world that folks in the United States and certainly the government realized, oh shit, we should have been paying attention to this a long time ago. And of course, here I am sitting as again, basically broke journalist saying, well, this is right up my alleyway. Maybe I can do a book about it. And thankfully my editor said, yeah, there seems like there's enough material here. So look, Trump's going to be back in the White House. I would be very surprised if we don't see more foreign lobbying, foreign influence scandals, foreign financing scandals, very, very soon, even as soon as next year, where this stuff, sorry, now my phone starts ringing as my wife is calling.
Oh, good.
Do not disturb is on, but still went through as she interrupts me mid-rant. I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if we see more foreign lobbying, foreign influence scandals very, very soon. And this does rise again in salience. Now, is that going to be enough to sway voters in 2 years or in 4 years? I don't know. Life is one of these things. Maybe you guys feel the same way. The more I learn, the more I read, it feels like the less I know. And I feel like more of an idiot than ever, but so it goes.
Yeah.
Something I'm curious about actually is, how does the US compare with other democracies around the world in terms of handling and regulating foreign lobbying?
So this is one of the, I don't know if it's an irony, but one of the clear lessons of putting this book together is that the US is absolutely the leader in terms of transparency requirements for what foreign lobbyists are doing, how much they're making, who they're doing it for, and how much success they're having. There was until very, very recently no other country, and certainly no other democracy, that had anything like the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Now we have Australia is the only other one that has anything like this. The United Kingdom is supposed to have their version of it coming online sometime pretty soon. The Canadians might at some point. The European Union might at some point. But there was certainly nothing like the United States of America. I mean, it really set the bar. It's not perfect. It's not flawless. There are plenty of ways to improve it, but it really set the bar for what other democracies around the world are now trying to set up for themselves, as they also realize that they are just as susceptible as the United States of America to these influence networks, to lobbyists on the ground, and especially to places, again, like the Chinas and the Russias and the Irans of the world that are looking for any opening that they can on the ground to influence policy and to influence Australians or Brits or Bulgarians or whomever it is. This is one of those few places where I can say the U.S. was great on this and remains great on this compared to what else is out there.
You know what's funny though? While that's amazing that we're the leader and we're doing such an amazing job, I was really hoping you were going to say, no, of course, there's this other country that does it better than us. We could learn from them, but we're okay. So, I mean, that's great. Anyway, that's still good, but yeah.
Well, look, I was just saying, the only way we're ever going to succeed in any of this is learning from one another. And so what's happening right now is the Brits and the Australians are learning from the U.S. and also learning how the U.S. side of things can be improved. And what I hope for is that, maybe not with this administration, but maybe the next administration, whoever learns from those examples and say, oh, okay, this is where they succeeded. This is where they failed. This is how we can improve. Because it's never, I mean, I think I'm cynical enough at this point to say, certainly not in my lifetime are we ever going to see the end of foreign influence campaigns and even foreign dictatorships themselves. But we can constantly be improving. And at the end of the day, learning from one another is the only way we're ever going to succeed in improving. Sorry.
No,
I interrupted you.
So I'm going to ask you now a difficult question. So in the next 4 years, right? So do you think, and obviously this is purely opinion based, but I'm curious about where you think this is going. So do you think so some of these transparency laws, like in relation to lobbying, maybe even more broadly, do you think in the next 4 years, the laws that actually made your book possible, do you think some of them at least will be repealed?
I don't know. So I guess my initial response is I don't think they'll be repealed. I don't think repealing them is the direction that the next administration will go in.
Hmm.
My concern is that they will be used only to target political opponents or those who they perceive as enemies, right? And this is obviously the rhetoric that Trump had been using on the campaign trail. If the independence of the Department of Justice, which it's been basically independent since the Nixon years, if that is eroded, if that is degraded, and now it's just another partisan arm of the Trump administration, which, maybe they have a constitutional argument that is what the case should be, then I can foresee a way that these laws are just used to target political enemies themselves, which, we've seen that. We would see that also across the board. It wouldn't just be foreign lobbyists themselves. It would be plenty. That's really my concern going in. And then the kind of the counterpart of that is that, what's the phrase? For my friends, everything; for my enemies, the law, right? Those Republican supporters or Trump supporters who are acting as foreign lobbyists, they wouldn't have to worry about any investigations or any enforcement. And again, they'd be able to make as much money as they want at the end of the day. I think what I'm hopeful for, and again, maybe you guys saw this in the book, is that the first Trump administration was actually great on a couple things, not the traditional lobbying side, but with things like think tanks and things like universities, which are again vectors of the foreign influence kind of world. Foreign governments have been plowing millions of dollars into American think tanks and American universities that don't have to disclose any of this information. The Trump administration was the very first one that said, no, hold on a second. You guys are taking in millions of dollars from the worst regimes on the planet. Let's have some insight into what you're doing. And for the universities, it was so funny. They've been taking in billions of dollars from the Russias, the Chinas, the Irans, the Saudis, the UAEs of the world. And there was a quote from one official at Cornell University, which they had been required to disclose like significant gifts. Cornell had been taking in almost $1 billion from these regimes.
Wow.
And hadn't disclosed any of this. And when Department of Education officials went to them and said, what the hell are you guys doing? You're supposed to be sharing some of this information. The word that Cornell University used was dumbfounded about where the money had been coming from, why they hadn't been disclosing it, and what they were doing. I mean, that was basically it, right? No one before the Trump administration cared. And so suddenly the Trump administration comes in and they're playing kind of catch up to where all this money had been coming from. And then you have places like Cornell, which is, it's a very good school, saying,
and very liberal. Yeah.
And very liberal, right? We have no idea where this money's been coming from or why we haven't been disclosing any of it. We'll try to do better in the future. And I guess I suspect a new Trump administration will come back to them and say, okay, have you been doing better? Have you been disclosing? I guess we'll see what their answer is this time around.
If you had to speculate, because I don't know if we have this information. I mean, what do you think was the purpose of, let's say, those donations specifically to Cornell?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Look, it's a great question because, again, we don't have contracts being disclosed. We don't have even necessarily who specifically. Is it a government embassy, a government official, some oligarch? We just know where the money is coming from, out of China or out of Russia, but we don't know specifically who it's coming from. So there's a couple reasons that regimes are donating or giving this money to universities. One is kind of just basic reputation laundering 101. They want to be seen as not a country that targets journalists or targets, religious minorities or ethnic minorities, whatever, but they want to be seen as someone or as a regime that supports higher education. I mean, it's basically the same reason any other donor wants to be giving this money. It's so that they can improve their reputation. But what these regimes are also doing, this is what I got into a little bit in the book, is that they are also using this money to open doors at these universities themselves. To access students, to access professors, and to access either former members of administration or potentially future members of administrations. Because again, remember, at the end of the day, a lot of these academics, especially at the more elite universities, are former members of government who have either just left office and are teaching, or if the election goes a different way in the next election, are going to be going back into office itself. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, right, if Kamala Harris is now looking at a visiting professorship in whatever university, and who knows what's going to happen in 4 years. And again, these universities are taking millions, in some cases billions of dollars from Qatar, from Rwanda, from Turkey, from whoever it is, and we don't know what they're doing with that. So it's accessing also those people on the ground in these universities. It's also accessing proprietary research. And this is, there was a case, especially out of Stanford, which had been taking tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars out of China. Wow. We don't know. Stanford did this weird thing where they anonymized all their donors on purpose. And so we don't actually know if it's like the Chinese health ministry, the Chinese education ministry, or just some wealthy Chinese tech whoever. But we do know they've been taking tens of millions of dollars from Chinese sources. And we also know that there was some kind of research relationship that allowed these Chinese sources access to at Stanford. And again, Stanford being one of the centers of, quantum computing and AI development and so on and so on. And so suddenly it's not just reputation laundering, and it's not just having meetings with students or professors or whatever it is. It's also about getting access to basic kind of espionage 101, access to all the cutting edge technology that these American institutions are researching or developing, and then theoretically using for the United States benefit. But again, this is where the lines between foreign lobbying and espionage really begin to blur. And there's a lot of overlap there. And there's still, look, a ton that we don't know about. And one of the potential silver linings of a Trump administration is that they could open the book back up again to what these universities especially have been doing.
Holy shit, man. Yo, yeah. that must be like one of the most mind-blowing things I've ever heard on this fucking podcast.
Yeah.
Holy shit. Because, when we think of universities, like we think of independent thinking, right? So, I mean, obviously, I understand that most of them are blue, but at the end of the day, you would think, okay, but they're being critical for like the good of the masses.
Plus, by the way, it's irresponsible to be conspiratorial in my thinking. So please take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But like, this also suggests that, I mean, so of course, maybe like when they're donating, they're trying to get a better rep for that particular country, whether it's Qatar, Russia, China. Okay. Right. To build relations and have that status. Sure. If I had to go an extra step, I mean, would it be too crazy to think that they're also influencing some of the things that are maybe on the, let's say, syllabus, in terms of what's taught,
books written,
maybe now, but I don't want to go that far. Like, again, please take that with a grain of salt, because at this point, this is just,
well, but the problem is
somebody forming a narrative.
Here's what I'm going to say. Here's what I'm going to say. You know why it wouldn't be your fault in thinking that way? Because there's no transparency.
It's not my fault, but at the same point, if we don't have the actual information,
no, but that's the point. We should have it.
I know, I agree. Yeah. But what the information we do have, right, is okay. Here are these donations. Here's like where they're from. Some are anonymous, and then that's really all you can factually really.
Well, or we could take it a step further and say, if these universities are supporting human rights, why the fuck are they taking money from dictators?
I'm with you. Trust me. I want to go there. I'm just saying I want to also just be a little bit responsible with my thinking and not go all the way with where your mind can really go when you start to speculate.
Right.
What is this? What are the implications?
Yeah.
I don't think it's conspiratorial at all. Just put yourself in like Beijing's shoes, right?
Yeah.
If you see you're already able to donate hundreds of millions of dollars to like Harvard alone, right? To say nothing of all the other universities around, the hundreds and hundreds of other universities. You kind of want as much as you can get, right? Just as any other investor would want a good return on that investment, all that money going there. You want to see what you can get away with. And it's not just meetings, and it's not just access to research. And I mentioned China because this is one of the countries that we do know about has had an impact on the ground in crafting syllabus and in crafting what students are learning about and what they are not learning about. This goes back to the I don't remember if I included this in the book or not, but The Department of Education had this big report about what these foreign countries are doing, and China was one of the main areas of focus. And what they found is at these universities, some of the universities that had been accepting money, all of a sudden students are being encouraged not to learn about or discouraged from learning about things like Tibet, things like Taiwan, things like what's happening with the Uyghurs. You know, the list goes on and on and on. And this isn't, you know, every single student in every single class, but, you know, there were very clear pieces of evidence and case studies where American students were being discouraged from researching, from learning about, and from pursuing more about what the Chinese state did not want them to learn about, what the Chinese regime did not want them to learn about. There was another, we didn't talk about this earlier, but the United Arab Emirates also, they did this interesting thing where they started opening up, they used funding, state funding, to start opening up satellite campuses for NYU, for Northwestern, in places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And, you know, at the time, these things are announced and they're like, oh, this is great. We're spreading American educational values around the world and to these countries that don't always have access to, you know, whatever it is, you know, access to information like we do in the United States. Isn't this a great thing? And what we saw end up taking place is that it wasn't that the United States of America was opening the doors for, you know, further learning for all these Emirati students or whoever was studying there. What ended up happening is it was the Emiratis that were opening the doors to use those methods of censorship, use those methods of surveillance, use those methods of targeting opposition voices or whatever it is inside the United States of America and inside these universities. Because what ended up happening is these universities ended up acquiescing to UAE requests, or maybe stronger than not quite demands, but saying it would be a great idea if you stopped carrying these books in your student library, if you stopped inviting these, you know, LGBT activists to have, you know, meetings or whatever on the ground, if you stopped discussing whatever the policies that the UAE wanted to see implemented, if you stopped discussing criticism of that. I mean, this is kind of the story really of the last 20, 30 years is that the United States thought, whether on the financial side or the education side, or even on the kind of the democratic policy side, they thought, okay, we open all these doors, we spread the American model around the world. And what we ended up seeing is that, yeah, the door was open, but what ended up happening is that it was these dictatorial practices that started slowly creeping in this way itself, and these authoritarian practices that started creeping in themselves, where Americans were just kind of asleep at the wheel. Both, you know, you and I and, you know, other just Americans on the ground, but folks in Washington as well, that just were not paying attention to any of this. I don't think it's too late. I'd like to think there's a little bit of reason for hope and optimism moving forward, although maybe it's a little tougher these days. But that's also the story in the education sector itself.
Yeah, and what a stretch to say, oh yeah, we're spreading education around the world by funneling billions of dollars into our universities. Oh, sure. Okay, that makes sense.
I know. Look, and I'm, you know, I'm a pretty liberal guy. I again have written very critically of Trump in the past. I mean, I have basically no disagreement with those on the Trump side of things and say, no, we need to go after these universities because they have, I mean, the hypocrisy that's like the minimum, right? It's all these other things that have been allowed to happen. I mean, I've got no love lost for these university administrators that say, yeah, it's a good idea to take hundreds of millions of dollars from despotic regimes, while, of course, all the while claiming to be this bastion of progressive values. I mean, it's just hypocrisy all the way down.
Wow. All right, man. Casey, man, you blew us away, dude. This was like such a phenomenal
This was amazing.
podcast.
Yeah.
All right, Alan, final questions for Casey before we wrap up, man.
Oh, yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Book is available in all bookstores now. Go to your favorite, go to your local bookstore and get it. Foreign Agents is what it's called. Folks want to follow me, I'm there on Twitter. I have a website, CaseyMichel.com, has regular updates on all articles. But I would point folks to the organization I work for, humanrightsfoundation.org, hrf.org, which, you know, I'm part of I'm a small part of a far bigger project to shine a light on how it is that these dictatorships around the world, they don't remain in their borders. They don't remain only in those countries. They spread their influence, they spread their money, and they spread their efforts around the world, and unfortunately have targeted Americans for years, and there's plenty more we can be doing about it. We do a lot of great work, and I'm very proud to be working there, especially these days. So that's
And
what
you
folks can follow.
and you especially have done really great work, man. So thank you again so much
Thanks,
for
guys.
coming on. And I gotta say, man, Brooklyn guests are the best.
Look, we do what we can. Obviously, I'm following in some big shoes with Mayor Eric Adams, but I appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys having me on and taking some of your weekend to chat with me about it. It's great. I had a great time. I got a little heated at the end, so I apologize about that. But thanks, guys.
All good, man.
No, it's
It's the
great.
New Yorker in you. All right, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take
All
care.
right. Thanks, guys.
That was great, by the way.
Very good.
So again, everyone, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.